Hey there, welcome back to another mini episode of Man v Mob. And this one is covering a bunch of different topics. And I suppose I'll start with stereotypes. Have you ever felt like you've been forced into fitting a stereotype? What I mean by that is, let me give an example. I was talking with a gay friend recently, and he was telling me how he often feels like other gay people who identify with the LGBT community sort of impose a certain idea of what a gay person should act like on him. And I think this is actually quite common, the feeling within these different identity groups that are very popular today, that although they are more welcoming than the traditional bigotry, they have their own impositions and their own policing within the group. And it's very authoritarian and very repressive in its own way, limiting, really. So there's a notion, I think, with a lot of people that they've come a long way and that they're glad that the bigotry isn't as bad as it once was. Yet at the same time, they feel like they're sort of trapped in this new um, repressive and conformist groupthink of the way that you ought to behave, whether you're a woman who has to um, deal with what feminists believe you should act like, and you have left behind the older notion of male chauvinism that used to be the old, um, I guess you could say, repressive force, or if you're black, the notion of older, harder bigotry is replaced by a more softer bigotry, which I've talked about in previous episodes, sort of like a softer bigotry of low expectations and having to fit the quote unquote black mold and the black identity. So like if you are just an individual and you have all these different opinions and you happen to go against the mob or the groupthink, then you're sort of persona non grata, and you have to just hold all of this in, because the worst situation would be to have nobody. It's sort of the lesser of two evils, a phrase that unfortunately we've become accustomed with the past two elections, right, where the candidates have been awful, and we've just said, well, I might as well accept the lesser of two evils. I think that's what a lot of people are experiencing today, is they feel like they obviously don't want to go back to the older forms of overt bigotry, but they feel like they can't, they feel like they're stuck in this current group that also has its own serious problems in limited ways of thinking. So what I think we need to do is realize that although what we have today in many ways is better than the older overt forms of bigotry, we have a new problem. We're sort of in a new paradigm where we have this sense of deference, this sense of patronizing, and of everybody has to fit a stereotype or a mold. So we need to be more mindful of that and accept that there is diversity within groups, between groups. It's not just every identity, white, black, brown, gay, straight, man, woman, trans. It's not that everyone in those groups behaves the exact same way or thinks the exact same thing. It seems like it should be obvious, but we really don't behave this way. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is how much of a motivator dullness is. And what I mean by that is boredom causes people to seek interest even when it's not remotely productive. Conflict generation. I think that we we mistake history when we look at some of the wars that have occurred, and we say that it was purely for patriotism or for honor. I think that something as mundane as dullness and boredom really caused a lot of people, was the seedbed of the patriotic fervor that was taken advantage of to get people, particularly um, young men during the World War I and World War II, to go to war. And it's the same thing with people who might just, I don't know, they might live in a rural community where there's not many things to do or to capture your attention, or maybe you live in a small town or something. So, or you are stuck in a dead end job where not much happens. Have you noticed how we tend to create conflict just to generate something interesting happening? So keep an eye on that and try to notice it happening, because it's pretty pervasive and it's a strong motivator for people. Think about the farming communities that existed just before the war and in the Great Depression. Think about how many people were just unemployed, not many prospects at all. And all of a sudden, the New Deal and the war effort open up the opportunity for excitement. It might not have offered the opportunity for enrichment, but it was purely, hey, do you want to make something of yourself? You could become a fighter pilot. You could fight Nazis. You could go someplace exciting. So I think we need to, as we build the future in the 21st century, we need to think about really capturing people's excitement and sort of going against dullness. The third thing that I wanted to bring up is moralist hypocrisy. You see this all over the place. What I mean by moralist hypocrisy is generally the person who is most devout and most morally superior has something to hide. So, for example, the Catholic Church, when they're talking about how you have to be pure and you have to behave in these heavenly ways, was conducting a massive pedophilia cover up and swapping priests from location to location to mask this giant pedophilia scandal. The same thing with, you think about actors on social media and at awards ceremonies, they're generally moralizing all the time about what people should pay attention to, how they're not being good enough, and what they're focusing their time on. Now, granted, I think part of that is from the sense that being an actor, you might have it easier than other people in respect to the amount of money you make versus uh, the effort that you put into your job, or the physical labor or something like that. So I think there's a little bit of a guilt in there. But I also think that there, just like with the church, there was a massive cover up in Hollywood of the casting couch, basically a cover up of rampant rape within Hollywood. And I'm sure that a lot of the people who went out and moralized at these award ceremonies and on social media knew exactly what was going on and didn't do anything about it and didn't stand up. Same thing with the priests. Same thing with the people back at, this was more of a thing back in the 80s, but people who were unfaithful in marriage. You found out that a lot of these particularly conservative politicians were having affairs, often to double up gay affairs, when they were also talking about homosexuality being a sin. So whenever you see somebody being overly moralistic, particularly we're seeing it now on social media, anybody is taking the opportunity to call other people out, to shame them, to completely build themselves up on the rubble of other people on social media. Take a long look at the individuals who engage in this behavior. I think that you'll find that they generally have something to hide, and it's generally their own moral flaw that they are trying to cover up. There's a great term called moral licensing. And what it means is when you do something that is considered um, generous or moral or ethical, like you donate to charity, you take that as license to do something shitty to somebody at another point in time. So maybe uh, you steal something from somebody because you say, oh, well, I give to charity. So people do that a lot. They morally license and reverse morally license. You'll see it. You'll see it everywhere. Um, the next one is having to fit a binary. I noticed this recently when I was having a conversation with somebody, and I wasn't clearly fitting within a category. I wasn't clearly a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal or progressive. And I really borrow, I'm fairly nuanced with the arguments that I make. So I borrow from a bunch of different ideas and sources and viewpoints. And that bugs people hardcore. It is seriously unsettling for people. And I think that the origin of that is something called category violation. And if you've never heard of that before, effectively what category violation is if you think about monsters in classic movies and books, they're generally combinations of different creatures or things. So like a sphinx has the body of a lion and the head of a human. Um, Frankenstein is a mix of a bunch of things. Uh, I can't really, off the top of my head, think of tons of different. There's a lot of the Minotaur has a bull head and a human body. Centaur. A lot of creatures, scary creatures, are combinations of things. So that is category violation. That it's something within the human mind is when you can't clearly place a label on something or confine it within a box, then it is inherently threatening because you can't determine whether it is friend or foe. And the simpler your mind is, the more threatened it's going to be by those violations. If you're more okay with things not fitting in strict categories and things just connecting in a more free floating, nebulous kind of way, which we're finding out really is the nature of information in the world. It's all connected in a networked way that isn't strictly confined to like bureaus or drawers within a bureau. So I also happen to think that this is where a lot of the resistance to trans comes from, because it's not something that is clearly man or woman. It crosses boundaries and it is category violation. So it's interesting because when you have conversations with someone and you don't clearly fit a binary, then you freak them out. And I had this experience with somebody recently where, and I'll get to this in a second, conspiracies, but it was a conversation about conspiracies. And to give a little bit of the background of it, they were comparing, or the conversation started with a meme that was comparing the recent explosion in Beirut, Lebanon, to the 9/11 towers falling. And I guess the tower or the structure in the middle of the Beirut explosion is still standing, even though it was a massive, massive explosion. And obviously the World Trade Centers fell down for a smaller explosion caused by the airplanes colliding. And I rarely engage on social media, but I was just like, you know what? Maybe if I intervene just to say one or two things, then this might cause people to realize that you should second guess conspiracy theories, because basically the argument that was being made in the meme is like, oh, this massive explosion left that tower standing, but the World Trade Centers fell down. I think there was more to it than met the eye with 9/11. Kind of the 9/11 was an inside job conspiracy. And so I started this conversation, and at one point in the conversation, there were two people that were engaging in the conversation with me. And at one point in the conversation, one of them just goes, wait a second, so I'm confused. Are you pro-conspiracy or anti-conspiracy? And really my point was like there have been all types of cover-ups, WMDs, Stellar Wind with Snowden, the Gulf of Tonkin, COINTELPRO, Chaos, Operation Northwoods, MK Ultra, many shady things. And what else? Edward Bernays and public relations. So there have been all kinds of shady cover-ups throughout history, and a lot of them have been uncovered, and they have documents to back them up, and there have been whistleblowers, and that is different for me than half-baked linking of different pieces of information on a forum, on an internet chat room somewhere, and effectively extrapolating on ideas and trying to overly link things that you have no evidence of and going above and beyond what you can prove. That is conspiracies. And what I was trying to say is people get a comfort out of conspiracies that everything is linked, because it's the same comfort that people get out of believing in a God, where they want to believe that the random, particularly the chaos and the destruction and the violence and the negative side of life has a reason behind it. That even if it's someone with nefarious objectives, that it is planned and it is somebody doing it, rather than it just being random or bureaucratic error. Like, for example, on 9/11, the CIA and FBI not properly communicating with each other. That is, in my opinion, what led to 9/11 is competition between these two agencies and not sharing information and bureaucratic error, rather than the CIA and the FBI teaming up and saying, it would be beneficial. Maybe we can get America to go to war if we organize this. So that was really what I was trying to present. And the response was, so I'm confused. Are you pro or anti-conspiracy? And it's interesting because I think what goes on in people's minds is they kind of crack their knuckles and they say, this is going to be easy. I know this person's position, and they have a script written for if they're depending on with the binary, which side they take. If they're pro and I'm pro, then there's nothing to argue about. If they're anti and I'm pro, then I've got the script written and I can just read the script off and easy peasy. But then if you're not easy to define, then I don't think this is a conscious thought, but the concern is, wait a second, is this person, first of all, I don't recognize what this person is. It implies that there could be other positions taken, or that maybe this person is reasonable. And if this person is reasonable, then that might imply that I'm not reasonable. And that can't be, because I am reasonable, because I know I'm reasonable. And there's sort of a short circuiting that occurs in people's heads when you're not fitting a narrow definition or a narrow binary. I think we all need to try to break out of the binary and the labels and violate categories left and right. No pun intended. We really shouldn't overly constrain ourselves to fit categories. I understand that they can be useful in a quick way, but in the increasingly complex world that we live in, categories and labels can strain in an extremely harmful way, much more so than ever before. So we need to move beyond the traditional notion that you can just fit everything and everyone into a box and put a few labels on that box. The last thing that I wanted to talk about, which I just touched on a little bit, is conspiracies in general. And I explained the main point in that I think that people find it comforting that something is organized in a way that explains what is happening. And while I do think that really we need to acknowledge that there are things going on that aren't in the official narrative that the media talks about, and that many mistakes are made. I think we need to be cautious in avoiding overly linking and overly connecting things. And it happens on both sides. It happens with the left and the right. And by the way, like I just said, they're more than sides, left and right. But conspiracies are something that we should talk about more, because I think that they tend to become the tools used by people with mental illness to really grow a support base. And that's going to be another episode, topic on mental illness. But I think that it's really something that we need to pay attention to, how people who might have delusions or fantasies or paranoid visions, they tend to start to overly connect things. And I've made this comparison before, or I've used this example. Alex Jones, he's the conspiracy theorist that is most popular now. And Alex Jones has been right about things in the past. He has had kernels of information that he has been absolutely correct about, cover-ups that have occurred, the CIA program to attempt mind control using hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, COINTELPRO, the FBI's program to basically infiltrate countercultural organizations like the Black Panthers or the student protest movements against the Vietnam War, or numerous others. These were things that actually happened. And we need to know about those things, and we need to address how we can prevent these sort of bamboozling and violating of the American people in the future. But we also need to realize that people who have disturbed minds, maybe they're schizophrenic, maybe they are just prone to paranoia, they tend to gravitate towards these. And if we allow people to basically treat them as a leader or a visionary, then things get bad real quick. Let me say that. We've seen this, I think, with demagogues, with cult leaders, and these things are on the rise. They're continuously an issue, but particularly in times of chaos and confusion, cults and scams and demagogues and narcissists and sociopaths, those all are on the rise. So I think we need to be more cautious and engaging, even with some of the fringe, to know what's going on. That has been why in the past I've really been against the notion of trying to just cancel speech outright, because I think it's important that you know what people are saying or what their ideas are, so that you can engage and try to convince when an idea is really ill-founded. And it's not always going to work, obviously, but it's better than sweeping under the rug and not realizing that a problem is festering. So that is the last of the topics for tonight. If any of those strike your interest, or if you have any thoughts or any personal experience with any of them, please leave a comment, send me a message on social media, and don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share these conversations with friends, family, anybody who will listen, people who like intellectual conversation, and more to come.